Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. We are going to continue our discussion of Unit 10 today and the post-war era. And as you can see, I did not change the name of Unit 2 because we're really just continuing the discussion of post-war society and culture. So don't forget to jot down some notes and send me a picture. All right. So one of the significant things that happened during this time was the ratification of the 18th Amendment. And this was an offshoot of the Progressive Era. One of the many progressive movements was geared toward prohibiting alcohol. And the reason why was that it was like a societal problem whereby men would work at the factory all day or the mine or wherever, stop at the bar on the way home, get super drunk, and then come home and beat their wives and children. And it wasn't just like an isolated incident, this was a major issue. So it was mostly middle-class women fighting for the prohibition of alcohol, and they succeeded with the 18th Amendment in 1919. And so this prohibited the manufacture, the transportation, the sale of alcoholic beverages. Okay, so this actually was successful. It did lead to a decline in alcohol abuse. Arrests for drunkenness decreased, alcohol-related deaths decreased, and men generally stopped spending their whole paycheck on alcohol. So there were some short-term victories there, but this was later repealed. So one of the interesting things that came from this was that, and you would guess that this would happen, once alcohol became illegal, people didn't stop drinking alcohol. It's like drugs are illegal, but people still do drugs. And so there were some who became really wealthy, some who became famous criminals like Al Capone off of the illegal booze trade and bootlegging. And so this type of lifestyle spawned corruption. All right, so the KKK re-emerges during this time. There's like a new Ku Klux Klan that is founded in 1915 by William Simmons, who is actually a former preacher. And under his leadership, they reached peak membership of 5 million people in 1923. And they didn't just target blacks, they also targeted immigrants, they targeted Jews, they even targeted Catholics and blacks, of course. And the way that they gained support was by appealing to people's sense of patriotism and nativism and even morality. They argued that people who came into the country from Southern and Eastern Europe brought in a different set of morals that didn't really line up with traditional Americanism. And so most of their support came from them pushing those ideals, and most of their support came from small towns, villages, and even some middle-sized cities in Midwestern and Western states. But you've probably seen in the movies KKK members burning crosses and things like that. This is what they did. They also intimidated business owners into firing their black employees. They organized mass demonstrations. Fortunately, because throughout the 20s, their leadership became divided and corrupt, they actually went on the decline. So in 1923, they had 5 million people. By 1930, they only had 9,000. And so this thing decreased really quickly. All right, so Sacco and Vanzetti. This is where you really see American nativist tendencies. So in April of 1920, 2 men killed a paymaster and a guard in broad daylight, and it was an armed robbery of the Slater and Morrill Shoe Company. And so this happened April 15th, 1920 in Massachusetts. So the people that they arrested, the 2 suspects that they arrested, were Italian immigrants, they were anarchists, and they were draft dodgers. And as a result of those things, they were declared guilty without a free trial. Oh my word, there is a typo. Let's fix it. I really like using this feature of edit. Hold on, where's my mouse? Okay. There we go. Look at that. That does not really look like a Y, but that's okay. They were declared guilty without a free trial. Not because people were outraged that they may have killed someone, because they were immigrants, because they were anarchists, because they didn't display their patriotism when they dodged the draft. And so the judge in this case was almost like the prosecuting attorney. Like, he was very clearly against Sacco and Vanzetti in this trial. So, for several years, lawyers sought appeals for a new trial that would be more fair, a new free trial, since this was such a travesty of justice. But that did not happen, as they were executed in 1927. They're not sure about Vanzetti, but modern ballistics actually suggests, from looking at Sacco's gun, that he probably was at least guilty. But they don't know for sure about Vanzetti. All right, literary trends after World War I. So literature after World War I gets kind of pessimistic and depressing because of the horrors of World War I. Because World War I was terrible, these writers became disillusioned with people in general and with society in general. And so sometimes this group of writers is called the Lost Generation. And this is like F. Scott Fitzgerald was like symbolized this lost generation. And these were writers who criticized the war, they criticized fundamentalism, extreme conservatism, and religious beliefs. They criticized small town values, and that came out in their writing. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby and This Side of Paradise, where you see this pessimism. Ernest Hemingway, probably the most talented of this group of writers, wrote The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms, that just, his kind of like typical transcendentalist, which is just a sense of outrage at life's meaninglessness, which was revealed by World War I, since life was so quickly just destroyed and societies went into upheaval and all that stuff. He said that basically life is meaningless. Sinclair Lewis wrote several works. One of them, Main Street, he portrayed the smug ignorance and the bigotry of the American small town. And then he wrote other things as well, where he just wrote scathing reviews of business in general and the medical profession and religion. Okay, so the new black. During this time, blacks who lived in the South, many of them sharecroppers, continued to migrate from south to north into cities so that they could find work in factories, which, as you know, factory life is not that glamorous, but when you're stuck in a cycle of poverty because of sharecropping, working in a factory in the north actually is a better prospect. Because of blacks moving en masse into the north, cities became segregated. And so ghettos formed where there were several black neighborhoods clustered together. One of the more militant voices for this new generation of blacks was Marcus Garvey, and he started the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which stressed black pride and a return to Africa. Garvey, unfortunately, was convicted of defrauding thousands of his supporters because he had a steamship line that went bankrupt, and investors accused him of fraud, and he actually was convicted and went to prison. All right, clusters of blacks. This is one benefit of blacks moving into northern cities, into ghettos, was that these clusters of blacks in cities allowed them to dominate certain districts, which allowed them to elect representatives to the state Congress and to federal Congress. And then the Harlem Renaissance. So Harlem became like a cultural center for writers and musicians and artists. This is where jazz became popular. And not just jazz, there were also black newspapers, magazines, theaters, black libraries, and this really was the center of black culture. So the United States experienced an era of economic expansion and economic growth after World War I. The U.S. was exceptionally prosperous during this time, during the 1920s, prior to the Great Depression, for a couple of reasons. Number one is that the trust busting of the progressive era pretty much came to an end as the government took their hands off of the economy. So they really embarked upon laissez-faire capitalism without the trust busting that had preceded it. So businesses boomed, wages rose, unemployment declined, and there was so much wealth in the United States that about 40% of all the world's wealth was in the Americas. And the reason for that not only was, this government policy of laissez-faire economics, but also pent-up demand from the war. Men came home from war with their pensions and were ready to spend money. They were ready to buy cars. They were ready to buy houses. And so this greatly stimulated the economy when they came back from war. So this also led to a new age of consumerism. A consumer is someone who buys a product or buys a service. And so producers would tailor their goods to meet consumer demand. And the advertising industry thrived during this time. They ensured that the demand for these products existed. So the automobile industry, of course, increased dramatically. Like I said, men who came home from war were excited and anxious to come home so that they could buy cars. By 1929, there were about 29 million privately owned automobiles. And so the car, obviously, not just an economic thing, but also a social thing. The car changed family life, it changed recreational patterns, and it made it possible for people to become more mobile. It became a symbol of American freedom, American prosperity, and individualism. And so behind this industry was Henry Ford, and we saw him in The Men Who Built America. He was a new type of businessman. He was a production genius. He wasn't a great inventor, but he was most responsible for the growth of the automobile industry because of the assembly line. He used the assembly line to mass produce cars. And so the way this worked was that you were given a job, like if your job was putting on steering wheels, that's what you did all day long. The car would go through the factory on a conveyor belt, and you would put steering wheels on all day long. It was monotonous, it was boring, and Henry Ford didn't even allow people to talk in the factory. He expected them to work really hard all day long. But you got really good at doing the one job that you were doing all day long. And because of that, he was able to produce cars really quickly. He also paid his workers well. He paid them enough so that they even could purchase a Model T. The Model T was a low-cost, well-constructed automobile, and the Model T dominated the market for many, many years. As time goes on, though, Ford is unwilling to cater to consumer demand. Basically, you could get the car in black, and that was it. And so other manufacturers were able to cut into Ford's share of the market. He also did not tolerate any union activity. In his eyes, he paid his workers well, and so he didn't allow them to join a union. He actually even employed spies to investigate the lives of his workers. Okay, and then the airplane. So World War I spurred the growth of airplane technology. The internal combustion engine makes motorized flight possible. And so World War I obviously sped the advancement of airplane technology. And most of the planes that were built in the 20s were intended for military use. Commercial air services, that is the transportation of people by airplane, developed more slowly than that. The first regularly scheduled passenger and mail service did not even begin until 1927. And this is the same year that Charles Lindbergh made the first nonstop flight from New York to Paris, 1927. All right, we're done. Have a great day. Don't forget to send me a picture of your notes.